Alright, in this video we're going to talk about counterplans. What is a counterplan? A counterplan offers an alternative way of dealing with problems in the world that were not the advocacy of the affirmative. Counterplans are going to utilize cost-benefit analysis, which means there will be an evaluation between the AF and the negative, and you're going to decide which one, either the counterplan or the plan, has more benefits than drawbacks. So this means that sometimes the affirmative and the negative would result in bad things happening. So your job is to convince the judge that either the counterplan or the plan has fewer drawbacks and is overall better and provides more benefit than the other side could possibly have. So, I just used the word net benefit, so we should talk about it. So, a net benefit is an articulated reason why the negative believes that a proposal is uniquely better than another proposal. So, this almost, not always, means that the counterplan avoids linking to a disadvantage that the affirmative would still link to. For example, if you were to read a state's counterplan, which is kind of the classic example here, it doesn't effectuate federal politics and effectuate a president's political capital or ability to get legislation passed. So the plan, if it uses the federal government, would effectuate the president's ability to get an agenda passed, which could have some bad ramifications of some sort. But the counterplan would not. And that would be what's called a net benefit, or a reason why, or a disad that applies to the AF but does not apply to the counterplan. And so you want to look out for net benefits. You got to know what your net benefit is. If you do not have a net benefit when reading a counterplan, you will not win. That's just kind of how that goes. The shells, this is the format for the old school way. They'll have a counterplan text of some sort. That counterplan text is going to look an awful lot like your plan text, except it might have some words different with them. In an old school shell, they would have a reason why the counterplan is not topical. This is a very old theory, and it relies upon the idea that the affirmative has to defend the entire resolution and not just their one specific example that they presented in the 1AC. So that's why this has kind of gone away as a whole. But just know that a counterplan back in the day used to have to be not topical. So if you see that there, it's just an old school formatting thing. They're not really reading topicality against you. The third part of a format that's there from the old school is they would have a reason why the counterplan has a net benefit, and they would explain what that net benefit is inside of their shell. This is also an old school thing that doesn't exist anymore in modern debate, but if you see it, no reason to be scared, no reason to be spooked. The last part of the old format for a counterplan shell is a solvency cards of some sort. It will be reasons why the counterplan is able to solve for whatever they're trying to solve for. The format in modern day is much more simplistic. It will have a text of some sort. The United States should, or the 50 states and all relevant territories should, and then it'll have a solvency card. If you are affirmative and you see the modern format of counterplan being read against you, you need to make sure to ask what are the net benefits right away. Competition. This asks the question, why is it that the counterplan must be done in isolation without the affirmative? Typically, the answer to that question relies on the cost-benefit analysis and the net benefit. Usually, a counterplan's argument as to why they cannot be done at the same time and the counterplan has to be done in isolation or independently of the affirmative is that there is a dised that would transpire in the world of the affirmative that you could just outright avoid if you do the counterplan by itself. The affirmative will test that logic by making what's called a permutation argument. And a permutation argue that all or some of the affirmative proposal and permutations will argue that the affirmative in its entirety, i.e. the entire 1AC plan text, and all or some of the negative can be done at the same time. And generally, if you want to win that permutation, you have to explain why all of the affirmative plus part or all of the negative counterplan would result in mitigating or making irrelevant the disadvantage that the negative claimed was a net benefit. There are several different types of permutations. I'm going to give you one legitimate, and then there are three sort of ways that permutations can cheat, quote unquote. The first is the only true legitimate form of permutation, and it will include all of the affirmative plan and all or some of the negative counterplan. So it will be all of the affirmative plan and all or some of the negative. So the cheating perms have different concepts to them. So a time frame permutation will have all of the affirmative and all or some of the counterplan, but it will also add the concept of time. We'll say things like following, then, after. So for example, if I have a plan of going to McDonald's to get a McFlurry, and the counter plan is to go to Wendy's to get a Frosty, a time frame permutation would say we will go to McDonald's to get a McFlurry today, but tomorrow we will go to Wendy's to get a Frosty. That would be adding an idea called time into the concept, to the competition equation. And generally that's cheating because it would overwhelm or mitigate some form of net benefit. But there are also reasons why many people consider it to be a legitimate type of permutation. That's obviously something that has to be debated out by the debaters. And you have to convince the judge one way or the other whether time frame permutations are legitimate or not. A second type of cheating permutation is an intrinsic permutation, which does all of the affirmative plus all or some of the counterplan, and then something not included in either. So it could be the go to McDonald's to get a McFlurry and go to Wendy's to get their French fries because they're better. That would be an intrinsic perm because while it does go to Wendy's, which was in the counterplan text, it purchases something different from that counterplan text. It says, I will do all of the affirmative, i.e. go get my McFlurry, and it then says, I will do some of the counterplan, going to Wendy's, and then it adds something that is in neither text, which is getting French fries. So that added part is the getting French fries component to it. And then there's a severance permutation, which would, what you are doing here is you are doing some of the affirmative with all or some of the counterplan. And this is just the affirmative jettisoning part of their plan text. Like they're not going to advocate for it anymore. And so usually this is one of the easier ones to convince a judge is cheating, because if the affirmative gets to change all the time, then it makes it impossible to be negative, because they would never be able to have arguments stick because the affirmative would just change what something means all of a sudden. And you can never have an actual in-depth debate. All right, there are different types of counterplans that exist inside a debate. The first is called a PIC, or a plan-inclusive counterplan, and it will do a lot of the plan, but it will exclude a key portion of it. The state's counterplan is a good example of this. So whatever the federal government is being advocated to be done in the 1AC, the negative is saying with their counterplan that do the thing that they wanted to do, but just have the states do it instead of the federal government. So it picks out of the federal government action and replaces it with just the state action. There's also what's called a uniqueness counterplan, and this is basically when a disad needs one thing to happen in order for uniqueness to be true for a disad. The counterplan can fiat that one thing happening. But the real hard part here, and the reason why you don't see a ton of uniqueness counterplans, is that the uniqueness that is provided by the counterplan can't overwhelm the link argument, which are usually tedious at best, or tenuous, well, tedious and tenuous at best for a disad. And so you don't see a terrible number of these. Consultation counterplans are mostly limited to foreign topics, although you do occasionally see them from time to time on domestic topics. But it will say, do the AF only if X party gives the go-ahead and says, yeah, we should do that. This usually has a relations net benefit of some sort. So, for example, the United States wants to do something, we should ask Japan first if they think it's a good idea. And the negative would say that is necessary in order to be able to have strong relations with Japan. Doing the AF without consultation to Japan would disrupt relations and make things really tenuous between Japan and the United States, and that would have really big bad impacts. But like I said, usually these are foreign counterplans, and they are not usually domestic topics, but you'll see them from time to time. Then there's the condition counterplan. Do the plan only if a certain thing happens first. It's usually a demand. The demand is being implemented, and the key is that if the demand would be met if only asked. So it's really hard to find in the literature base something like that, where the condition would be met in very easily. It just hasn't happened yet and is relevant to the plan text of sorts. And a lot of people consider consultation and condition counterplans cheating, so that's a thing as well. But usually you're going to hear PICs, and you're going to hear PICs mostly because they have the most competition. From time to time you'll hear about one thing that's not listed on here, which is called an advantage counterplan. And an advantage counterplan is when the negative advocates for something that has nothing to do with the plan in its entirety, but will solve one of the problems that the 1AC articulated as a problem. So this will happen a lot in climate change debates. The AF will come up and say, hey, we should do this regulation in order to be able to prevent climate change. And the negative will be like, hey, instead of a regulation, let's just do this other thing to solve climate change, like cloud manipulation and iron seeding, to be able to offset climate change and cause a negative feedback loop, which is something completely different. It has nothing to do with CO2 emissions, etc. That's called an advantage counterplan. Now, some people argue that it's a PIC still because it still uses the federal government. Therefore, there is a similarity between the counterplan and the plan. Just remember that an advantage counterplan just looks like it is doing something completely random. All right, there are generally 3 statuses to a counterplan, and a status just means what are the conditions that have to take place for a 2NR to decide they are not advocating for the counterplan anymore? So in what world does the negative decide they're not advocating the counterplan anymore? A lot of times this decision doesn't happen until the 2NR as to whether the negative wants to abandon the counterplan or not. But you need to ask earlier what the status is so you can condense or expand portions of the debate based upon that knowledge. So the three different statuses of a counterplan generally are unconditional. It means that no matter what happens in the debate, the advocacy of the negative will be the counterplan inside of the 2NR. Dispositional. This is a very old school concept that usually isn't talked about much anymore, but it means that the negative will go for the counterplan in the 2NR as long as there is not a permutation made from the affirmative and there are no theory arguments as to why the counterplan is illegitimate. But people kind of have warped this definition, and so it's always important to ask what they mean by dispositional in order to kind of know what conditions they can get rid of a counterplan. And then there's conditional, and that means that the negative has no obligation to advocate a counterplan at any point after reading it in the 1NC. And so they could get rid of it and not advocate it and go back to the status quo or go for a critique, etc., inside of any debate they want. Here are some tips about some counterplans. The first is, if you are neg, you must know the answer to the following questions, and if you are af, you should be asking these questions. 1, what is the status of the counterplan? We've already discussed this. Are you unconditional, dispositional, or conditional? 2, what does insert whatever word the negative said the status is here? What does that mean? So they'll say it's quasi-conditional, and you're like, what does quasi-conditional mean? You want to ask that pretty much every time so that you are for sure positive as to whether they are going to be going for the counterplan in the 2NR or not. 3, is there a choice the affirmative can make to force you to advocate the counterplan? This isn't like the best question in the entire world, but it is something that it can help if you aren't entirely sure. And you can make some strategic decisions based upon the answer to that question. And then lastly, what are the net benefits to the counterplan? This is a key question because you need to know what are the things you have to be able to explain why the permutation would be able to solve. If you're af and if you're neg, you have to be able to explain why that net benefit prevents the permutation from working. So the reality is when you're talking about counterplans, know on a very baseline level, a counterplan is just an alternate government proposal to solve some problems. And usually the problems that the counterplan is trying to solve are the problems that are inside of the 1AC. You're both trying to solve for the same problems, and you're arguing about which proposal would better solve those problems. That is the debate behind a counterplan. So if you know nothing else, know this. Counterplans are alternate proposals generally trying to solve the same problems as the 1AC, and the argument that is occurring is about which, either the plan or the counterplan, best solves that problem and avoids other bad things from happening, i.e. cost